The moment my son told me to abandon my home, the world seemed to collapse inward, as if the walls I'd built with love and sacrifice had turned against me. My name is Clara, and at 68, I've spent 42 years in this house, a humble two-story with a sagging porch and a garden that's been my sanctuary since before Michael was born. Every corner of this place holds a fragment of my soul, the faint scratches on the oak floors from Michael's toy train's The Kitchen Table, where we laughed over spilled flour during holiday baking. The creaky staircase where I carried him to bed when nightmares woke him. I thought those memories were a bond, a tapestry woven from years of devotion. But that afternoon, as I stood in my living room, Michael's voice sliced through that illusion. "Mom, it's time to move on," he said, his eyes hard, unfamiliar. "A nursing home is where you belong now. This house isn't yours anymore." I can still see him leaning against the doorway, his arms crossed his tone, sharp and impatient, as if I were a problem to be solved. His wife Karen sat stiffly on the couch, her hands folded in her lap, her nod a silent endorsement of his verdict. My grandson, Tommy, sprawled on the rug, pushing his toy cars in looping patterns, unaware that his parents were unraveling my life. I wanted to cry out to remind them that this was my home, that I'd raised Michael within these walls, that every choice I'd made was for him. But my voice faltered, caught in the ache of my throat, and my gaze drifted to the mantel to a faded photograph of Michael and me at his college graduation. His smile was wide, then his arms slung around my shoulders, my heart swelling with pride. That boy was a memory. The man before me saw me as an obstacle. I'd been alone for 8 years, a widow since my husband George slipped away. He'd built a small construction business from sheer grit, and when he died, I sold it, tucking the money into savings for our family's future, Michael's future, Tommy's future. I lived simply clipping coupons, mending old clothes, believing that's what mothers do, give everything even when it carves pieces from your own heart. But that day, Michael didn't see a mother. He saw a burdened old woman cluttering a house he coveted for himself. "You're not safe here alone," he said, his voice coated with a pretense of care. "You're forgetting things, Mom. We're just looking out for you." Forgetting I could recite every lullaby I'd sung to him, every school play I'd clapped for, every tear I'd wiped away. But he wasn't listening. He'd already erased me from his story. The silence that followed was heavier than his words. Karen stared at her hands, avoiding my eyes. Tommy hummed softly, lost in his game. Michael stood there expectant, as if I'd simply nod and pack my life into a suitcase, disappearing to make room for their plans. I felt like a ghost, invisible in the home I'd built, my presence reduced to an inconvenience. For decades, I'd poured love into this family, every meal I cooked, every fever I nursed, every dream I nurtured, and now they were casting me aside like a worn-out quilt no one wanted. I wanted to fight to tell him he had no right to banish me, but grief choked me, and all I could muster was a faint, "I'll consider it." He sighed as if I were the one being unreasonable and ushered Karen and Tommy out. The door closed with a soft thud, leaving me in a silence that felt like drowning. That night, I curled into my armchair, the one George used to mock for its gaudy flowers, his eyes twinkling with affection. The house was so quiet I could hear the faint tick of the kitchen clock each second, a reminder that time was slipping through my fingers. I thought about my life, how I'd been a school teacher before Michael, shaping young minds with stories and patience. How I'd set that aside to raise him to be the mother he needed. How I'd held George's hand through his final days, whispering love until he was gone. I'd always been the steady one, the one who carried the weight so others could stand. But now I felt small, insignificant, as if the world had decided I no longer mattered. My son, the child I'd cherished above all else, had looked at me and seen nothing worth keeping. I rose and walked to the hallway mirror, its frame nicked. from when Michael at 10 had swung a toy sword too wildly. My reflection stared back, gray hair swept into a loose bun, deep lines carved around my eyes, a face that bore the weight of too many years. Was this who I was now, an old woman to be tucked away, forgotten? I pressed my hand to the glass, my fingers shaking, and whispered, "Clara, where did you go?" The words hung in the air unanswered, and tears came. Not for George, not for Michael, but for the woman I'd buried beneath years of giving. I cried for the dreams I'd shelved, the laughter I'd silenced, the self I'd lost to love. The next morning I woke with a heaviness that clung like fog. I brewed my coffee, the familiar ritual, a small anchor, and sat at the kitchen table gazing at the garden through the window. The roses bloomed fiercely, their petals a vivid red against the green, a reminder of the life I'd tended here. Michael's words echoed nursing home, not safe burden. Safe from what? From living, from loving. I'd spent my life shielding others, and now I was the one being pushed into the shadows. I thought about calling him, begging him to see me, to remember who I was. But something held me back, a flicker of defiance, a spark of anger I hadn't felt in years, buried deep beneath the weight of duty. I wandered through the house, my fingers tracing the dining table, where we'd shared countless Thanksgivings, the bookshelf filled with George's dog-eared mysteries, the quilt I'd stitched for Michael's crib. Its colors faded, but soft. Each touch was a memory, a piece of my story. This was my home, my legacy, and I wasn't ready to surrender it. But Michael's voice lingered, and I knew he wouldn't stop. He and Karen had their vision, a bigger life, a bigger house, as if I were a relic standing in their way. I thought of Karen's tight smile, her whispered asides about space and their future, and my chest tightened. They wanted me gone, not just from the house, but from their lives. Yet as I stepped into the garden, the morning sun warm on my skin, something stirred within me. It wasn't hope, not yet, but a question. What if I didn't let them define me? I knelt beside the rose bush, its thorns sharp against my fingers, and inhaled the sweet, earthy scent of the soil. I thought of the years I'd spent planting, pruning, coaxing life from this earth. I wasn't done growing. Not yet. I clipped a single rose, its petals soft, its thorns unyielding, and held it in my palm. The pain was slight, but grounding, a reminder that I was still here, still alive. I had no plan, no clear path forward, but I knew I couldn't stay still, couldn't let their words strip me of my worth. I'd spent too long giving my time, my heart, my dreams, without asking for anything in return. Maybe it was time to claim something for myself. Maybe it was time to fight, not with shouts or tears, but with a strength they'd never anticipate. As I stood in the garden, the rose in my hand, I made a silent promise I wasn't leaving. Not like this. Not until I'd reminded them and myself who Clara truly was. The days after Michael's visit blurred into a haze of silence and shadows. I woke each morning to the same quiet house, the same ticking clock, the same garden roses blooming as if nothing had changed. But everything had. My son's words. "This house isn't yours anymore" had carved a wound that wouldn't close, and every creak of the floorboards, every glint of sunlight on the kitchen counter felt like a reminder of what I was losing. I was Clara? 68, a mother, a widow, a woman who'd built a life on love only to watch it crumble under the weight of betrayal. I wanted to call Michael to hear him say it was a mistake, that he hadn't meant to push me away. But the phone stayed untouched on the counter, and deep down I knew he wouldn't call either. He'd made his choice, and I was no longer part of it. I tried to keep busy to fill the emptiness with routine. I swept the porch, though it was already clean. I watered the garden, though the soil was still damp. I baked a batch of oatmeal cookies, the kind Michael used to beg for, but the smell only brought tears, and I left them uneaten on the counter. The house felt too big, too hollow, as if it were mourning with me. I'd always thought of it as a living thing filled with the laughter and love of my family. Now it was a shell, and I was the ghost haunting it. I'd catch myself standing in doorways staring at nothing, or sitting in George's old study surrounded by his books, wondering how I'd become so invisible. The loneliness was a weight I couldn't shake. I'd never been one for self-pity. George used to say I was the strongest person he knew, but this was different. This wasn't just grief or loss, it was abandonment, raw and deliberate. My own son, the boy I'd carried taut, loved through every storm, had looked at me and decided I was disposable. And Karen, with her clipped words and averted eyes, had agreed. Even little Tommy, my sweet grandson, hadn't looked up from his toys as they left. I didn't blame him, he was only 6, but the memory of his indifference stung. I'd always been the one to hold the family together to mend the cracks. Now I was the crack, and no one cared to fix me. I stopped answering the phone. Not that it rang often, most of my friends had drifted away after George's death, their lives moving forward while mine stood still. The few who called left voicemails, their voices cheerful but distant, asking how I was promising to visit. I didn't call back. How could I explain that my son wanted me gone? That I was afraid to leave my house because it felt like admitting he was right. Instead, I retreated inward my world, shrinking to the garden, the kitchen, the armchair where I'd sit each night clutching a cup of tea that grew cold in my hands. One morning, about a week after Michael's visit, I forced myself to walk to the corner store. I needed milk, or so I told myself, but really, I needed to feel like I still belonged to the world. The street was quiet, the air crisp with the promise of fall. I moved slowly, my knees, stiff my heart, heavy aware of every step as if I were trespassing in a life that no longer wanted me. The store was small, its shelves cluttered with cans and jars, the fluorescent lights buzzing overhead. I was reaching for a carton of milk when a voice startled me. Clara Thompson, is that you?" I turned to see a woman about my age, her hair a soft silver, her eyes bright behind wire-rimmed glasses. It took me a moment to place her Dorothy, a fellow teacher from my days at the elementary school, someone I hadn't seen in years. She smiled, and it was so warm, so genuine that I felt a pang of something I couldn't name. "It's been forever," she said, stepping closer. "How are you holding up?" Her question was kind, but it pierced me. I wanted to tell her the truth, to spill the hurt and betrayal, but shame held me back. Instead, I managed a weak smile. "Oh, getting by." Dorothy didn't push, but she didn't leave either. She walked with me to the counter, chatting about her grandkids, her book club, the community center where she volunteered. Her life sounded full, vibrant, and for a moment, I envied her. As we stepped outside, she touched my arm. "Clara, you should come to the center sometime. We're always looking for folks to help with the kids' reading program. You were the best teacher I knew." Her words caught me off guard. The best teacher. I hadn't thought of myself that way in decades, not since I'd traded lesson plans for motherhood. I mumbled something about being busy, but Dorothy pressed a flyer into my hand. "Just think about it," she said, her smile unwavering. "You've got so much to give." I walked home, the flyer crumpled in my pocket, Dorothy's words echoing in my mind. So much to give. Did I? I'd given everything to Michael, to George, to this family, and it hadn't been enough. But as I stepped into my garden, the roses nodding in the breeze, I felt a flicker of something, pride maybe, or defiance. I wasn't ready to believe Dorothy, not yet, but her kindness had cracked open a door I'd thought was locked. That night, I smoothed out the flyer on the kitchen table, staring at the words, "Volunteer. Make a difference." I didn't call the number, but I didn't throw it away either. It sat there, a small, stubborn reminder that someone had seen me even if my family hadn't. The next day I found myself in the garden again, kneeling in the dirt, pulling weeds, with a focus I hadn't felt in weeks. The earth was cool under my fingers, the scent of soil grounding me. I thought about Dorothy, about the life I'd had before Michael, before George, when I'd stood in front of a classroom and watched children's faces light up as they read their first words. I'd been good at that, hadn't I? I'd made a difference, even if it was small. As I worked, a neighbor, Mrs. Alvarez, leaned over the fence, her apron dusted with flour. "Clara, those roses are stunning," she called. "You've got a gift." I smiled, surprised by how good it felt to be noticed. "Thank you," I said, and for the first time in days, my voice didn't tremble. Mrs. Alvarez lingered, asking about my garden sharing tips, about her own. She was younger, maybe 50, but her warmth was unguarded, and I found myself talking about the roses, about George, even a little about Michael, though I skirted the truth. When she left, promising to bring me some of her homemade tamales, I felt lighter, as if the world had tipped slightly back into place. I wasn't healed, not even close, but these small moments, Dorothy's smile, Mrs. Alvarez's kindness, were like stones in a river guiding me towards something I couldn't yet see. That evening, I stood in Michael's old bedroom, untouched since he'd moved out years ago. His baseball trophies still lined the shelf, his posters curled at the edges. I'd kept it like a shrine, a testament to the boy I'd raised. But as I looked at it now, I saw something else, a room frozen in time, holding me back. I didn't touch anything, not yet, but I closed the door with a quiet resolve. This house was mine, and so was my life. Michael might want me gone, but I wasn't ready to disappear. I sat in my armchair, the flyer from Dorothy on the table beside me, and sipped my tea, still warm this time. The loneliness was still there, sharp and heavy, but it wasn't the only thing. There was a spark now, faint, but growing, a whisper that maybe I wasn't as finished as Michael thought. I didn't know what came next, but as I looked out at the garden, the roses glowing in the moonlight, I felt a strength I'd forgotten I had. It wasn't loud or fierce, but it was mine, and it was enough to keep me going. The weeks that followed felt like walking through a fog, each day blending into the next, heavy with the ache of Michael's betrayal. I, Clara, 68, and worn by years of giving, moved through my house like a stranger, touching familiar objects, the chipped teapot, the quilt draped over the couch, as if they could anchor me to a life that still felt mine. The garden remained my refuge, its roses a quiet rebellion against the emptiness inside me. But even there, Michael's words haunted me. "A nursing home is where you belong." They echoed in the rustle of leaves and the clink of dishes as I washed them alone in the silence of a phone that never rang. I wanted to believe I could fight that the spark I'd felt after Dorothy's kindness and Mrs. Alvarez's warmth was enough, but doubt clung to me, whispering that I was too old, too broken to matter. I avoided mirrors now, afraid of the woman I'd see, gray hair, thinning eyes dulled by grief, a face that seemed to apologize for existing. I'd always been proud of my strength, the way I'd carried George through his illness, the way I'd raised Michael to chase his dreams. But now that strength felt like a lie. My son saw me as a burden, and the world seemed to agree. The mail piled up on the counter, bills and catalogs I couldn't bring myself to open. The neighbors' voices drifted through the windows, children laughing, couples chatting, and I felt like an outsider in my own life. I'd built this home for love, for family, and now it was a cage holding me captive with memories I couldn't escape. I stopped going to the corner store, afraid I'd run into Dorothy again, afraid her kindness would unravel me further. I told myself I was fine, that I didn't need anyone, but the lie was thin. At night, I'd sit in my armchair, the floral one George loved to tease me about, and stare at the flyer Dorothy had given me. Volunteer, make a difference. The words mocked me. Make a difference. I'd spent my life trying to do that, and look where it had gotten me alone. Discarded my own son, ashamed of me. Yet I couldn't throw the flyer away. It sat on the table, a challenge I wasn't ready to face but couldn't ignore. One afternoon, as I knelt in the garden, pruning the roses with hands that trembled more than they used to, I heard a knock at the door. My heart leapt foolishly, hoping it was Michael come to apologize, to say he'd been wrong. But when I opened the door, It was Mrs. Alvarez holding a foil-covered dish and smiling like she'd known me forever. "Tamales," she said, thrusting the dish into my hands. "I promised, didn't I?" The warmth of the food seeped through the foil, and for a moment I felt seen, not as a mother or a widow, but as Clara, a woman worth visiting. I invited her in more out of politeness than want, and we sat at the kitchen table, the tamales steaming between us. Mrs. Alvarez Lydia, she insisted I call her, talked easily, her voice a melody of stories about her kids, her garden, the bakery where she worked part-time. I listened, nodding, afraid to say too much, afraid my pain would spill out and ruin the moment. But Lydia had a way of drawing people in, and before I knew it, I was talking about my roses, about how George used to call them my second children. She laughed, and the sound was so bright it startled me. "Clara, you've got a gift," she said, echoing her words from the fence. "Not just with plants, but with stories. You should share them." I shook my head, brushing off the compliment, but her eyes held mine. "I mean it. The world needs people like you." Her words stayed with me long after she left, lingering like the scent of tamales in the kitchen. Share my stories. I hadn't thought of myself as someone with anything left to offer. But Lydia's visit had stirred something, a memory of who I'd been. Before Michael, before George, when I'd stood in a classroom and taught children to love words. I'd been good at that, hadn't I? I'd made them feel seen, important. Maybe I could do that again. The thought was terrifying, but it was also a lifeline pulling me from the fog. The next morning, I forced myself to pick up the phone. My hands shook as I dialed the number on Dorothy's flyer, my heart pounding like I was a schoolgirl asking for a favor. When Dorothy answered, her voice was as warm as I remembered. "Clara, I was hoping you'd call." I stumbled through my words, saying I might be interested in the reading program, that I wasn't sure I'd be any good. She laughed, not unkindly. "You'll be wonderful. Come by tomorrow. We'll start small." I hung up my chest tight with fear, and something else, excitement maybe, or hope. That evening, I stood in Michael's old bedroom again, the air thick with dust and memory. The trophies, the posters, the faded curtains, they were a shrine to a boy who no longer existed. I ran my fingers over a baseball glove on the shelf, remembering the games I'd cheered at, the nights I'd stayed up sewing his uniform. I'd loved that boy with everything I had, and he'd grown into a man who wanted me gone. The pain was sharp, but as I stood there, I felt a shift. This room wasn't my life anymore. I wasn't sure what was, but I knew I couldn't keep living for a past that didn't love me back. The next day, I walked to the community center, my steps slow but deliberate. The building was modest, with peeling paint and a sign that read, "Welcome all." Inside, Dorothy greeted me like an old friend, introducing me to a handful of volunteers and a group of children who fidgeted in their chairs. They were 7, maybe 8, their eyes wide and curious. Dorothy handed me a book, a simple story about a lost puppy, and asked me to read. My voice cracked, at first unsteady from years of silence. But as I read, the children leaned closer, their faces softening. When I finished, a girl with pigtails raised her hand. "Can you read another one?" she asked. I smiled, my heart swelling, and said yes. It was a small thing reading to those children, but it felt like a victory. For an hour, I wasn't the woman Michael wanted to erase. I was Clara, the teacher, the storyteller, the woman who could still make a difference. As I walked home, the autumn air sharp against my cheeks, I felt lighter, as if I'd shed a layer of grief. The pain was still there, raw and deep, but it wasn't the only thing defining me. Dorothy's belief, Lydia's kindness, the children's smiles, they were threads weaving something new, something mine. That night, I sat at the kitchen table, the flyer now pinned to the fridge, with a magnet shaped like a sunflower. I thought about the roses in the garden, how they bloomed despite neglect, despite storms. Maybe I was like them, battered but still growing. I didn't know how to face Michael or if I ever could, but I knew I wasn't ready to give up. Not on this house, not on myself. As I sipped my tea, the warmth spreading through me, I made another silent vow I'd keep going one small step at a time until I remembered who Clara was meant to be. The community center became my lifeline, a tether to a world I'd almost forgotten. Each Tuesday and Thursday, I walked the 6 blocks to read with the children, my steps steadier, now my heart a little less heavy. I was Clara, 68, still bruised by Michael's betrayal, still haunted by the echo of his words. This house isn't yours anymore, but no longer defined by them alone. The children's laughter, their eager hands clutching books, their shy smiles when I praised their reading stitched something back together inside me. It wasn't healing, not yet, but it was growth, like the roses in my garden pushing through frost to bloom again. I began to see myself not as the mother Michael rejected, but as a woman with stories to share, a woman who could still matter. Dorothy noticed the change. One afternoon, as we tidied the reading room, she handed me a cup of chamomile tea and said, "Clara, you're glowing. Those kids adore you." I blushed, waving off her words, but she leaned closer, her eyes kind but piercing. "I mean it. You're not just teaching them to read, you're teaching them to dream." Her words caught me off guard, lodging in my chest like a seed. Teaching them to dream. I'd done that for Michael once, hadn't I? I'd filled his world with possibilities only for him to turn away. But these children with their wide eyes and fearless questions saw me. They didn't care about my gray hair or my trembling hands. To them, I was Miss Clara, the lady with the stories. At home, the silence wasn't as suffocating anymore. I started small changes, reclaiming the house as mine. I cleared the dining table of unopened mail, polishing the wood until it gleamed. I hung a new curtain in the kitchen, a soft blue that caught the morning light. I even opened George's study, dusting his books and arranging them by author, something I hadn't done since he died. Each act felt like a declaration. I was still here, still living. Michael might want me gone, but this was my home, and I wasn't ready to surrender it. One evening, as I sat in my armchair with a book I hadn't touched in years, I found myself thinking about the money from George's business. I'd sold the construction company after his death, a decision that had felt like losing him all over again. The money, hundreds of thousands carefully invested, sat in accounts I rarely touched, saved for Michael and Tommy for their future. I'd always seen it as my final gift to them, a way to ensure their happiness. But now, the thought of it made my stomach twist. Michael didn't want me in his life. Why should I hand him my legacy? The idea was startling, almost forbidden, but it took root, growing in the quiet of that evening. I didn't act on it right away. Instead, I started asking questions. I called my bank, speaking in a low voice as if Michael might overhear, and asked about my accounts, my investments, my options. The manager, a kind woman named Susan, was patient, explaining terms I'd never bothered to learn: trusts, beneficiaries, transfers. I took notes in a spiral notebook, my handwriting shaky but determined. Each call, each question felt like a step towards something I couldn't yet name. I wasn't sure what I'd do, but the knowledge that I had control, that I could choose, was a spark of power I hadn't felt in years. Lydia, my neighbor, became a steady presence. She'd stop by with leftovers or invite me to her porch for coffee, her warmth pulling me out of my shell. One afternoon, as we sat with mugs steaming in the October chill, I told her about Michael, not everything but enough. I spoke of his coldness, his demand that I leave, my fear that I'd lost him forever. Lydia listened, her face soft but fierce. "Clara," she said, setting her mug down, "you're not the one who's lost. He is. You're still here, still fighting. Don't let him take that from you." Her words were a mirror reflecting a strength I was only beginning to recognize. Inspired by Lydia, I started writing. At first, it was just fragments, memories of teaching, of George's laugh, of Michael as a boy. I'd sit at the kitchen table, the flyer from the community center pinned to the fridge, and let the words spill onto paper. They were messy, raw, but they were mine. One night I wrote about the day Michael was born, how I'd held him and promised to give him the world. The memory hurt, but it also reminded me of who I'd been, a woman who loved fiercely, who built a life from nothing. I wasn't done being that woman. At the community center, I took on more. Dorothy asked me to lead a storytelling workshop for the kids, and though I hesitated, I said yes. The first session was terrifying, 10 children staring at me, waiting for magic. I told them a story about a rose that grew in a storm, its petals stronger for the rain. They listened rapt, and when I finished, a boy named Jamal raised his hand. "Miss Clara, is that you? Are you the rose?" I laughed, surprised, and said, "Maybe I am." The truth of it settled in my bones. I was battered, yes, but I was still growing. These small victories built a quiet confidence. I started wearing George's old watch, its leather band worn but comforting, a reminder of the life we'd shared. I bought a new dress, a deep green that made me feel alive, and wore it to the center, smiling at Dorothy's whistle of approval. I even began to think about the house not as a shrine to Michael, but as a space for me. I cleared out his old bedroom, not throwing anything away, but boxing it up, making room for something new. A guest room, maybe, or a place to write. The act was symbolic, a way of saying, this is my life now. The money loomed larger in my mind. I met with Susan at the bank, a discreet appointment I scheduled on a day I knew Michael wouldn't visit. She walked me through my options, her voice steady as she explained how I could protect my assets, create a trust, or redirect funds. I listened, my heart racing, not because I wanted to hurt Michael, but because I wanted to honor myself. I'd given him everything, my time, my love, my dreams, and he'd thrown it away. Maybe it was time to give something to Clara. As I walked home, the autumn leaves crunching under my feet, I felt a shift. The pain of Michael's rejection was still there, sharp and deep, but it wasn't the only thing I carried. I had Dorothy's faith, Lydia's friendship, the children's trust, and my own growing sense of worth. I wasn't ready to confront Michael, not yet, but I was building something, a life, a legacy, a strength that no one could take away. In the garden that evening, I planted a new rose bush, its roots deep in the soil, a quiet promise to myself. I was Clara, and I was still here blooming in spite of the storm. The autumn days grew shorter, the light in my garden softer, but inside me, something was brightening. I was Clara, 68, a woman who'd been cast aside by her son, Michael, yet was learning to stand taller in the wreckage. His words. "A nursing home is where you belong," still stung sharp as the thorns on my roses, but they no longer held me captive. The community center, with its noisy children and Dorothy's warm encouragement, had become a second home. My writing, once just scattered thoughts, was filling notebooks, each page a step toward reclaiming the woman I'd buried under years of sacrifice. And the money, George's legacy, my security, was no longer just a gift for Michael's future. It was mine to shape a power I was beginning to wield. I started each morning with purpose now. I'd brew coffee, sit at the kitchen table, and write the pen, moving faster, as memories poured out, teaching children to read, dancing with George in the living room, even the quiet moments of my own childhood chasing fireflies in a field. The words were a mirror showing me a Clara who was more than a mother, more than a widow. I'd been a dreamer, once a woman who laughed easily, who believed in her own strength. Writing brought her back, piece by piece, and with her came a resolve I hadn't felt in years. I wasn't just surviving Michael's betrayal, I was rebuilding. At the community center, my storytelling workshops grew. The children, once shy, now clamored for my stories, their hands waving with ideas for the next tale. I'd weave their suggestions into narratives about brave flowers, lost stars, or animals who found their way home, each story a quiet reflection of my own journey. One afternoon, a girl named Sophia with braids and a gap-toothed grin tugged my sleeve after class. "Miss Clara, your stories make me feel strong," she said. I knelt to her level, my throat tight, and said, You make me feel strong, too. Her words stayed with me, a reminder that I was building something new, not just for myself, but for others. Dorothy began to nudge me further. "Clara, you should share your writing," she said one evening as we stacked chairs. "Not just with the kids, with everyone. Maybe a reading at the center." I laughed, the idea absurd. My words were private, raw, not meant for an audience. But Dorothy's eyes sparkled with that stubborn faith I'd come to rely on. "You've got a gift," she said. "Don't hide it." I didn't agree not then, but the seed was planted, and I found myself wondering what it would feel like to stand in front of others to claim my voice. Lydia, too, pushed me forward. She'd started joining me in the garden, her hands quick with pruning shears, her stories filling the air. One crisp afternoon, as we planted bulbs for spring tulips, I told her about the money, how I'd saved it for Michael, how I was now considering other paths. I expected her to caution me, to say family came first, but she nodded, her eyes fierce. "Clara, that money is yours. You earned it, keeping George's business alive, keeping your family together. Use it for you." Her words were a permission I hadn't known I needed. That night, I pored over my bank statements, the numbers no longer intimidating, but empowering. I wasn't ready to decide, but the possibility of choice felt like freedom. I met with Susan, the bank manager, again this time with a clearer purpose. I wanted to understand every option: trusts, investments, donations, anything that would protect my future and honor my worth. Susan was patient, her voice calm as she explained how I could set up a trust that ensured my independence or redirect funds to causes I cared about. "You have more control than you think," she said, and I believed her. I left the bank with a folder of papers and a sense of agency I hadn't felt since I was a young teacher shaping my own classroom. The money wasn't just George's legacy, it was mine, and I would decide its story. At home, I continued to transform the house. I painted the guest room, once Michael's, a soft lavender, and hung new curtains letting light flood the space. I moved my writing desk there, facing the window where I could see the garden. Each change was a reclaiming, a way of saying, "This is my home, my life." I stopped keeping Michael's trophies on display, packing them carefully but firmly into storage. I wasn't erasing him, but I was making room for myself. One evening, I found an old photo album in George's study filled with pictures of us, our wedding, Michael's first birthday, a trip to the coast. I didn't cry, though the ache was there. Instead, I placed the album on the coffee table, a reminder of the life I'd built, not the one I'd lost. My confidence spilled into small, defiant acts. I wore George's watch every day now, its ticking a steady companion. I joined Lydia for a baking class at her bakery, laughing as we fumbled with dough, my hands remembering how to create. I even started answering the phone again, reconnecting with old friends who'd left voicemails I'd ignored. One, a former colleague named Ruth, invited me to a book club, and though I hesitated, I went surprised by how easily I slipped into discussions about novels and life. These were small steps, but they were mine, each one, a brick in a foundation I was building. The thought of Michael lingered, a shadow I couldn't fully shake. I hadn't heard from him since that day. No calls, no visits, not even a note. Part of me still hoped he'd come back, that he'd see me and realize his mistake. But another part, stronger now, knew I couldn't wait for his approval. I was done living for his validation. One night, as I wrote in my notebook, I penned a letter to him, not to send, but to release. I poured out the hurt, the love, the anger, the pride I was rediscovering. "You wanted me gone," I wrote, "but I'm still here, and I'm enough." I folded the letter and tucked it into a drawer, feeling lighter, as if I'd shed a weight I'd carried too long. In the garden, I planted more daffodils, hyacinths, a new rose bush with petals the color of dawn. Each root I pressed into the earth was a promise, a vow to keep growing. Lydia joined me, her laughter mixing with the rustle of leaves, and we talked about dreams we'd set aside, dreams we might still chase. "You're not done, Clara," she said, her hands caked with soil, not by a long shot. I believed her not because I was fearless, but because I was learning to trust myself again. As I stood in the community center one Thursday reading a new story to the children, I felt a shift. Their faces, bright with wonder, reflected a Clara who was more than Michael's mother, more than George's widow. I was a storyteller, a teacher, a woman with a voice that still mattered. Dorothy caught my eye from the back of the room, her smile proud, and I knew I was ready for more, not just for the kids, but for myself. I didn't know what that meant yet, but I was no longer afraid of finding out. In my garden that evening, the new rosebush swayed in the breeze, its petals catching the last light. I touched its leaves, my fingers steady, and whispered, "We're just getting started." Winter crept into the garden, frosting the roses and turning the air sharp. But inside me, Clara, 68 and scarred by Michael's rejection, a warmth was spreading. The community center my writing, the friendships with Dorothy and Lydia. They were roots anchoring me to a life I was building, not just enduring. Michael's words, "This house isn't yours anymore," still echoed, but they were fainter now, drowned out by the laughter of children, the scratch of my pen, the quiet certainty that I was more than the mother he'd discarded. I was no longer waiting for his apology or his approval. I was choosing myself, and that choice was reshaping everything. Each morning I rose with a clarity I hadn't known in years. I'd brew tea, sit at my desk in the lavender-painted guest room, and write stories, memories, dreams I'd forgotten I had. The notebooks piled up their pages, a testament to a Clara who was alive, vibrant, unafraid to claim her voice. I wrote about the classroom. I'd loved the way George's eyes crinkled when he laughed, the girl I'd been at 20 full of ambition and fire. I wrote about Michael, too, not with anger, but with a kind of sorrowful honesty, tracing the boy he'd been and the man he'd become. The act of writing was a reclamation, a way of saying, "This is my story, and I will tell it." At the community center, I was no longer just a volunteer. Dorothy had convinced me to lead a writing group for adults, a small circle of women my age who gathered to share their own stories. The first session I stood at the front of the room, my hands trembling, feeling like the novice teacher I'd been decades ago. But as the women spoke about lost loves, quiet triumphs, dreams they'd buried, I found my voice. I shared a piece I'd written about my garden, how it had survived storms and neglect, how it had taught me to keep growing. When I finished, the room was silent. Then Ruth, my book club friend, said, "Clara, that's beautiful. You're beautiful." The words landed like a gift, and I realized I was no longer hiding. The group became a sanctuary. We met weekly, our stories weaving a tapestry of resilience. One woman, Helen, spoke of leaving an unkind marriage. Another, Marie, of raising a child alone. Their courage fed mine, and I began to share more, not just my writing, but my truth. I told them about Michael, about the nursing home, about the hurt that had nearly broken me. They listened, their eyes soft, their hands reaching for mine. "You're not alone," Helen said, and for the first time I believed it. These women like Dorothy and Lydia saw me not as a burden, but as a force. My meetings with Susan at the bank grew more purposeful. I'd decided to create a trust one that would secure my future and protect the money from George's business. I wasn't cutting Michael out, not entirely, but I was ensuring he couldn't touch it without my terms. Susan walked me through the details, her voice steady as she outlined how I could designate funds for myself, for causes I cared about, even for Tommy, my grandson, in a way that honored my values. "You're taking control," she said, and I nodded my chest tight with pride. The money was no longer a gift I owed Michael. It was a tool, a way to build a legacy that reflected who I was. I started researching charities, small organizations that helped children read, supported single mothers, or preserved community gardens. I wanted the money to do good, to echo the life I was reclaiming. One evening, I called Dorothy and asked about the community center's funding. "We're always scraping by," she admitted. "A donation could change everything." I didn't promise anything, but the idea took hold away to give back to the place that had given me so much. I began to see the money not as a burden, but as a seed, one I could plant for others. At home, the changes continued. I turned the guest room into a proper study with shelves for my notebooks and a lamp that cast a warm glow. I hung a painting I'd bought at a local fair, a swirl of roses and sky, a reminder of my garden's resilience. I cleared more of Michael's things, not with anger, but with a quiet acceptance that this house was mine now. I kept one photo of him on the mantel, a snapshot from when he was 10, his grin wide as he held a fish he'd caught. It wasn't a shrine, but a nod to the love I'd always carry, even if he didn't return it. Lydia noticed the shift. "You're different, Clara," she said one afternoon as we sipped coffee on her porch, the air smelling of snow. "You're standing taller." I laughed, but I knew she was right. I felt it in the way I walked to the center, the way I spoke in the writing group, the way I looked at my reflection without flinching. I was wearing brighter colors now, scarves and sweaters that made me feel alive. George's watch was a constant on my wrist, its ticking a reminder of the time I still had. One evening, Dorothy called with a request that stopped me cold. "Clara, we're hosting a community event, a fundraiser. I want you to read one of your stories." My stomach twisted. Reading to the children was one thing. Sharing my writing with strangers was another. "I don't know," I said, my voice small, but Dorothy was relentless. "You're ready. Trust me." I spent days agonizing, rewriting my garden story, practicing in front of the mirror. The fear was real, but so was the pull to be seen, to stand in my truth. The night of the fundraiser, I stood backstage at the community center, my hands clutching my pages, my heart pounding. The room was full, neighbors, volunteers, families, even Lydia, who waved from the front row. Dorothy introduced me, her voice proud, and I stepped into the light. My voice shook at first, but as I read about the roses, the storms, the strength in survival, the words steadied. The audience leaned in their faces soft, some nodding, some wiping tears. When I finished, the applause was warm, enveloping, and I felt a rush of something I hadn't known I could feel, again, pride. Afterward, people approached me, strangers and friends alike, saying my story had moved them, that it made them think of their own struggles. Lydia hugged me, whispering, "You're a force, Clara." Dorothy handed me a glass of punch, her eyes gleaming. "Told you," she said. I laughed, my heart full, and for the first time in months, Michael's absence didn't define me. I was Clara, the storyteller, the woman who'd faced her fear and found her voice. In the garden the next morning, I knelt beside the new rose bush, its buds tight but promising. The air was cold, but the soil was warm under my fingers, alive with possibility. I thought about the trust, the community center, the stories I still wanted to tell. I was building a life not just for now, but for the future, a legacy that wasn't about Michael, but about me. The pain of his betrayal was still there, a quiet ache, but it was no longer my center. I was my own center now, and I was growing stronger every day. The winter deepened, wrapping my garden in a quiet frost, but inside me, Clara 68 and forged anew by months of growth, a fire burned steady. The community center fundraiser had changed something fundamental. I'd stood in front of a room full of people, shared my story, and felt their warmth lift me. Michael's rejection. A nursing home is where you belong was a scar still tender but no longer bleeding. I'd built a life beyond his cruelty with Dorothy's faith, Lydia's friendship, and the children's trust. My writing filled notebooks, my voice carried weight, and the money from George's business was now a tool in my hands, shaped by my choices. I was no longer the woman who'd crumbled under my son's words. I was Clara, and I was ready for what came next. The community center became a hub of activity as the holidays approached. I threw myself into preparations, helping decorate, organizing a book drive for the children, even reading at a Christmas event. My voice steady now, my stories weaving hope into the cold air. Dorothy and I grew closer, sharing late-night teas and dreams for the center. She told me about its struggles, leaky roofs, outdated books, not enough staff, and I listened the idea of a donation growing stronger. I'd been meeting with Susan, the bank manager, weekly, finalizing the trust. I'd set aside funds for my future, for Tommy's education, and for causes I believed in, including the center. Michael's name was no longer on the accounts, a decision that felt both painful and liberating. I wasn't punishing him, I was protecting myself. Lydia noticed my resolve. One snowy afternoon, as we baked cookies in her kitchen, she said, "Clara, you're not just surviving, you're thriving." Her words landed like a truth I'd been afraid to claim. Thriving. I thought of the roses dormant now, but alive beneath the snow, waiting for spring. I was like them, rooted deep, ready to bloom again. I told Lydia about the trust, about my plans for the center, and she grinned, raising her coffee mug in a toast. "To you," she said, "to the woman who didn't let them win." I clinked my mug against hers, my heart full, but a part of me still braced for Michael. I hadn't seen him in months, and though I'd stopped waiting for his apology, I knew our story wasn't finished. That moment came sooner than I expected. It was early January, the air bitter, the garden a patchwork of white. I was in the kitchen writing when the doorbell rang. My heart stuttered. Michael hadn't visited since that awful day, and I'd stopped expecting him. I opened the door to find him standing there alone, his coat dusted with snow, his face tight with something I couldn't read. "Mom," he said, his voice low, "we need to talk. No apology, no warmth, just a demand." I stepped aside, letting him in my hands steady despite the ache in my chest. This was my home, and I wasn't afraid. He sat at the dining table, the one I'd polished to a shine, and launched into his speech. "Karen and I have been thinking," he said, not meeting my eyes. "The nursing home is the best option. We found a good one not too far. You'd be comfortable." His words were rehearsed, but they hit like a slap. I waited silent, letting him continue. "This house is too big for you, Mom. It's not safe. And we could use the space. Tommy's growing. Karen's pregnant again. It makes sense. Pregnant again." The news should have brought joy, but it felt like another wall between us. He wanted my home, my life, to make room for his. I looked at him. The boy I'd raised, the man who'd forgotten me. His eyes were cold, his hands restless, as if he expected me to agree to pack my bags and disappear. A year ago, I might have crumbled, begged him to reconsider. But not now. I stood, walked to the counter, and poured myself a glass of water, my movements deliberate. "Michael." I said, my voice calm but firm. "This is my home. I'm not leaving." He blinked, surprised, then frowned. "Mom, be reasonable. You can't manage alone. And the money, Dad's money, it could help us help the kids." The mention of the money was a misstep, and I saw it in his eyes, the flicker of greed he couldn't hide. I sat across from him, my hands folded, George's watch ticking softly on my wrist. "The money," I said, "is no longer yours to claim." His face changed confusion, giving way to anger. "What are you talking about?" he demanded. I took a breath steady and told him the truth. "I've created a trust. The money from your father's business is secure for my future, for Tommy's education, for causes I believe in. You're not a beneficiary, Michael. Not anymore." The words were heavy, but they felt right, like a weight I'd finally set down. He stared at me, his mouth open as if I'd spoken a language he didn't understand. "You can't do that," he said, his voice rising. "That money was for the family." I didn't flinch. "I am the family," I said, "and I've spent my life giving to you. You wanted me gone, Michael. You don't get to decide what I do with my legacy." The room was silent, the air thick with his shock. I didn't raise my voice, didn't cry. I sat there dignified, the woman I'd become, and let my words settle. He tried to argue, his voice sharp, accusing me of selfishness, of betraying him, but I was unshaken. I told him about the community center, the children I taught, the stories I shared. I told him about the trust, how it would support Tommy, how it would help others. "I'm not taking anything from you," I said. I'm giving to myself something you never thought I deserved." His face reddened, but he had no answer. For the first time, he saw me not as a burden, but as a woman with power, with choices, with a life he couldn't control. Michael left without another word, the door closing softly behind him. I stood in the quiet, my heart pounding but not breaking. I'd expected pain, maybe regret, but instead I felt free. I'd faced him not with anger or vengeance, but with the quiet strength I'd built over months. He'd come to take my home, my future, and found a woman who wouldn't yield. I walked to the garden, the snow crunching under my boots, and stood by the rose bush, its branches bare but alive. I touched its thorns, a silent thank you to the Clara who'd kept growing. The next week, I went to the community center and told Dorothy I wanted to make a donation anonymously for now. We sat in her office and I handed her a check, the amount enough to fix the roof, buy new books, hire a teacher. Her eyes widened, tears brimming. "Clara, this will change everything," she said. I smiled, my heart full. "It already has," I replied. The act wasn't about Michael or revenge. It was about me, about the legacy I was choosing, the difference I could make. As I walked home, the winter sky clear above me, I felt a peace I hadn't known was possible. Michael's reaction, his anger, didn't define me. I was Clara, the storyteller, the teacher, the woman who'd turned betrayal into strength. The garden waited dormant but promising, and I knew I was ready for spring. Spring unfolded slowly like a promise kept, and my garden woke with a quiet beauty, its roses unfurling petals that caught the morning light. I was Clara, 68, a woman who had walked through the shadow of Michael's betrayal and found a path to light. His words, "A nursing home is where you belong," had once cut me to the bone, but now they were a faint whisper, drowned out by the life I'd built with my own hands. The community center, my notebooks filled with stories, the friendships with Dorothy and Lydia, the trust I'd shaped from George's legacy, they were my roots, grounding me in a truth I'd almost forgotten I was enough. I'd found peace not in erasing the pain, but in growing through it, in choosing to live fully, fiercely for myself. The community center was alive with spring's energy. The donation I'd made anonymously, though Dorothy's knowing glances suggested she'd pieced it together, had breathed new life into the place. The roof was sturdy. The library shelves overflowed with colorful books, and a new teacher, a young woman with a laugh like bells, led classes that echoed with children's voices. I was there most days reading to the kids, guiding the women's writing group, my heart swelling with each moment I was seen, valued, needed. The children called me Miss Clara, their small hands slipping into mine, their questions bright and fearless. The women in my group shared their lives, griefs, joys, dreams reborn, and I shared mine, no longer afraid of my own truth. This was my community, my home in a way I hadn't expected, a family born not of blood but of choice. Dorothy was my constant, her warmth a steady light. We'd sit in her cramped office after hours sipping chamomile tea, planning events, or dreaming up ways to grow the center. One evening, as the sky turned gold outside, she leaned back in her chair and said, "Clara, you've changed this place, not just with the money, but with you." I blushed, shaking my head, but she held my gaze. "I mean it. You give these kids hope, these women courage. You're a gift." Her words settled deep like rain in dry soil. A gift. I'd spent so long feeling like a burden, Michael's rejection, a weight I couldn't shed. But here in this modest building with its creaky floors and mismatched chairs, I was something else, a woman who mattered. Lydia, too, was a pillar. We'd spend hours in the garden, our hands in the earth, planting bulbs or pruning roses, our laughter mingling with the hum of bees. The new rosebush, its petals a soft pink, was thriving, a mirror of my own renewal. One afternoon, as we sat on my porch with coffee, the air sweet with jasmine, Lydia asked about Michael. Any word from him, she said, her voice gentle but direct. I sipped my coffee, the question stirring a familiar ache. "No," I said. Not since that day. I told her about our confrontation, how I'd stood my ground, how the trust had shifted everything. She nodded her eyes fierce with pride. You did what you had to, Clara. You chose you. Her words were a balm, easing the lingering guilt. I could love Michael, but I didn't need his forgiveness to live. Michael's absence was a quiet void. He hadn't called, hadn't visited, hadn't tried to bridge the gap. I'd finalized the trust months ago, securing the money from George's business for my future, for Tommy's education for the community center, and other causes, a literacy program, a women's shelter, a garden preservation fund. I'd written a letter for Tommy to be given when he was older, telling him his grandmother loved him, that the money for his college was her gift. Michael's name wasn't in it. I didn't hate him. I could never hate the boy I'd raised, but I'd given him everything once, my heart, my years, my dreams, and he'd cast me aside. I could carry love for him, but it no longer defined me. I was Clara, and my life was my own. The house reflected that truth. The lavender study was my haven, its shelves heavy with notebooks, the rose painting glowing in the sunlight. I was working on a book now, a collection of stories, some for children, some for the women in my group, woven with themes of resilience and hope. Dorothy and Lydia pushed me to publish, and though the thought made my stomach flutter, I was starting to believe I could. The guest room, once Michael's, was a space for others. Now Lydia's daughter, my book club friend Ruth, even Dorothy for a weekend when her pipes burst. I kept one photo of Michael on the mantel, the boy with the fish, his grin wide and unguarded. It wasn't a shrine, but a quiet acknowledgement of the love I'd always hold, even if it wasn't returned. The house was mine, every corner a testament to the woman I'd become. One spring morning, the community center hosted a celebration for the new library wing, funded partly by my donation. The room was alive with color balloons, banners, children darting between tables piled with cookies and juice. I was asked to read, and I chose the story of the rose that bloomed through a storm, the one that had carried me through my own darkness. Standing before the crowd, neighbors, families, volunteers, Lydia, beaming in the front row, I felt no fear, only strength. My voice was clear, the words flowing like water, and when I finished, the applause was warm, wrapping me like an embrace. Sophia, the girl with the gap-toothed smile, ran to me, her arms wide. "Miss Clara, you're the best," she said, and I hugged her, my eyes stinging with joy. After the reading, Dorothy pulled me aside, her face soft with something unspoken. "Clara, we have a surprise," she said, leading me to the library wing. A small crowd gathered, their smiles expectant, and Dorothy gestured to a plaque on the wall. Clara's Corner. It read simple but elegant. I froze, my breath catching. "I wanted it anonymous," I whispered, but Dorothy shook her head. "We knew it was you," she said, "and we wanted to honor you not just for the money, but for your heart." Tears spilled down my cheeks, not from sorrow, but from a gratitude so deep it felt like grace. I hugged Dorothy, then Lydia, who joined us, and the crowd clapped their warmth, a tide that lifted me. That evening I walked home under a sky painted with sunset, the air warm and fragrant. In the garden, I knelt by the pink rosebush, its blooms vibrant against the green. I'd been thinking about a gesture, something to mark this chapter, to honor the journey. I slipped George's watch from my wrist, its leather soft from years of wear, its ticking a companion through my darkest days. I dug a small hole beside the rosebush, the soil cool under my fingers, and placed the watch inside, covering it gently. It wasn't about letting go of George, but about weaving him into the earth that had held me, a symbol of the love that had shaped me and the strength I'd found alone. I pressed my hand to the soil, whispering, "Thank you," to him, to the roses, to the Clara who'd refused to break. I thought of you, the women watching, the ones who've been overlooked, dismissed, told your time has passed. I see you, your quiet strength, your unspoken dreams, the love you've poured into others only to be forgotten. I want you to hear what I've learned, not through anger or triumph, but through the slow, steady steps of rebuilding. Your worth isn't measured by who accepts you, but by how you choose to honor yourself. You are enough right now as you are, and there's still time to bloom, to write your story, to live a life that's yours. I stood the garden glowing in the twilight and walked inside the house, embracing me with its warmth. I lit a candle on the kitchen table, its flame small but unwavering a light for the path ahead. I was Clara at peace, not because the pain had vanished, but because I'd built a life that held it a legacy that would outlive it. The roses would bloom again tomorrow, and so would I.